You have been taught to believe a comforting story about emotional pain. The story says that if you communicate honest, love sincerely, remain open, and act with good intention, the world will eventually recognize your value and respond with loyalty, respect, and fairness. It is a seductive narrative, almost spiritual in its optimism, but it is also dangerously incomplete. In practice, it often becomes the reason people stay exposed in situations that repeatedly harm them. They mistake vulnerability without boundaries for strength, and kindness without strategy for moral superiority. Over time, that imbalance does not produce respect, it produces exploitation. Human behavior does not automatically reward goodness, it responds to structure, consequence, and perceived leverage. When someone gives without limit, forgives without condition, and tolerates without resistance, they are not always seen as virtuous. In many cases, they are seen as manageable, predictable, even replaceable. This is the uncomfortable divide between moral ideals and psychological reality. One is how we wish people behave, the other is how people actually behave when incentives are unclear and boundaries are absent. This is where a harder philosophy of emotional survival begins. Not cruelty, not coldness, but clarity. A recognition that emotional pain is not only something that happens to you, it is something that often happens through the authority you unconsciously grant others over your internal state. When you allow someone else's approval to define your worth, their rejection will inevitably feel like injury. When you allow their presence to define your stability, their absence will feel like collapse. The wound is not created by their action alone, but by the significance you assign to it. At the center of this dynamic is emotional dependency disguised as connection. The moment your nervous system believes that losing someone means losing stability, you become negotiable. You begin to adjust yourself in real time to prevent abandonment. You over-explain. You overgear. You tolerate inconsistencies you would normally reject. Not because you lack intelligence, but because your internal system has assigned survival value to the relationship. And once survival is involved, logic becomes secondary. Historically, power has always depended on this principle: whoever controls fear controls behavior. If a person, institution, or system can make you afraid of loss of love, status, money, identity, you will unconsciously organize yourself around preserving it. That is the hidden structure behind many unequal relationships. Not force, but attachment. The way out of this structure is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional independence through exposure. The mind must be trained to witness the worst-case scenario without fragmentation, to mentally simulate loss until it no longer produces collapse. When you can imagine rejection, abandonment, or failure, and remain internally intact, the leverage others hold over you begins to dissolve. Not because the situation becomes desirable, but because it becomes survivable. And survivability is what removes fear from the equation. Once fear is removed, the entire power dynamic changes. Requests become optional. Threats lose weight. Silence becomes tolerable. You stop negotiating your behavior based on the anxiety of what someone else might do. Instead, you act from a baseline of internal continuity. This is not indifference, it is structural resilience. A second layer of psychological protection comes from understanding the difference between your authentic inner life and the version of you that interacts with the world. Most suffering comes from failing to separate these two domains. People bring their raw emotional center into environments that were never designed to hold it safe. They expose their deepest insecurities in spaces reward performance, not vulnerability. Then they are surprised when those vulnerabilities they used against them. A more stable architecture involves distinction. There is a private self complex, sensitive, evolving, and deeply selective about access. And there is a social self adaptive, composed, and designed to interact with unpredictability without exposing the core. The social self is not a lie, it is a filter. It translates internal reality into external behavior without revealing unnecessary fragility. Without this separation, every interaction becomes personal. Every criticism becomes identity-level damage. Every cold response becomes emotional injury. But when the separation exists, external behavior is processed differently, not as invasion, but as surface-level information. The core remains untouched, not because it is defended aggressively, but because it is not directly exposed. Another critical shift involves the removal of unrealistic expectations about human change. Much emotional suffering is not caused by what people do, but by the expectation that they will eventually become different from what they consistently demonstrate. People repeatedly invest emotional energy into potential rather than pattern. They relate to who someone could be under ideal conditions, not who they repeatedly are under real ones. This creates a cycle of disappointment. Each new incident of inconsistency is processed as a surprise, even when it is statistically predictable. The emotional system interprets repetition as anomaly because hope keeps writing interpretation. The cost of this pattern is exhaustion, not dramatic collapse, but slow erosion of clarity. When expectation is replaced with observation, something stabilizes. Behavior becomes data rather than betrayal. You stop arguing with reality and start working within it. This does not require cynicism. It requires accuracy. You can still care about people without mislabeling their patterns. You can still engage without pretending unpredictability is reliability. From there, emotional control becomes less about suppression and more about non-participation. Most reactive suffering comes from immediate engagement with provocation. An insult triggers defense, a threat triggers anxiety, a withdrawal triggers pursuit, but in each case, the reaction is optional. There is a small but critical gap between stimulus and response where identity can intervene. In that gap, you can choose not to escalate internally. You can observe instead of absolve. You can allow words, tone, or behavior to exist without converting them into internal disruption. This is not passive submission. It is selective processing. Not everything that enters your awareness deserves emotional investment. A powerful extension of this is learning to disengage from verbal conflict altogether. Many arguments are not requests for understanding, they are attempts to establish dominance, release frustration, or provoke reaction. Engaging in them as if they are logical exchanges gives them more structure than they deserve. Sometimes the most stable response is not rebuttal, but neutrality. Not agreement, not resistance, simply non-escalation. There is also a paradoxical strength in strategic agreement. When someone attempts to define you through accusation, the instinct is to correct the narrative, but constant correction keeps you trapped in their framing. Patiently, removing resistance entirely dissolves the dynamic faster than defense ever could. When there is no opposition to push against, the conflict loses shape. Ultimately, all of these principles converge on a single realization: much of human emotional suffering is produced by misplaced control. The belief that you can manage how others behave, perceive, or value leads to chronic internal instability. The more tightly you hold that belief, the more vulnerable you become to its violation. Psychological independence begins when you stop outsourcing emotional stability to external validation. When you stop treating approval as safety. When you stop treating rejection as destruction. When you stop assuming that clarity from others is necessary for clarity within yourself. This does not lead to emotional emptiness. It leads to emotional containment. You still feel, but feelings no longer dictate structure. You still connect, but connection is no longer dependency. You still engage, but engagement is no longer surrender. At that point, something fundamental shifts. Interactions become lighter. Conflict becomes less personal. Loss becomes less catastrophic. Not because life becomes gentler, but because your internal architecture becomes less fragile. You are no longer negotiating your stability moment by moment based on external behavior. And in that condition, a quiet form of power emerges. Not loud, not performative, not dependent on dominance over others, but rooted in self-governance. The ability to remain intact regardless of emotional weather. The ability to observe without being absorbed. The ability to care without collapsing. That is the real foundation of psychological sovereignty, not the absence of pain. but the removal of unnecessary vulnerability to it. A mind that can witness chaos without becoming it. A self that can move through uncertainty without dissolving. And once that structure is in place, the world no longer defines your internal state. It simply moves through it.